Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for being amenable to the Wednesday switch instead of the Thursday. So this is our last part dealing with Purim. By next week we'll have transitioned. I wanted to... Yep, we'll see. But Megillat Esther, the Gemara establishes, was written with Ruach HaKodesh. There are many books that have been written, but not all of them are incorporated into our Tanakh. Only those that have been written with Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh is this divine, the Holy Spirit, divine intuition, with something that went beyond just a human being writing a book. But there was this divine component that went into their wording, into the knowledge that they had when they wrote this Sefer, and the knowledge that is imparted throughout the Sefer. It goes beyond this world. And there were many of our Sifrei Tanakh, actually the Gemara will be skipping on this Daf Zayin and Megillah, actually goes into some of the other ones that they were unsure. Should it be canonized? Should it be considered part of Tanakh or not? Right? We have Mishlei, we have Kohelet, where there seem to be contradictions within the Sefer itself. And the Gemara tells of how one of the great sages took barrels of oil up into the attic, and in order to burn, what's the expression? The nighttime flame?
Midnight oil.
To burn the thank you, Linda. To burn the midnight oil until he was able to resolve all of those seeming contradictions, right? So there is a high bar that needs to be passed in order for something to be considered Sifrei Tanakh. And there were debates amongst the sages about certain Sfarim, certain books, were they considered Sifrei Tanakh or not? And we'll see when it comes to Megillat Esther, there was more of a debate than just the content, but if this was something that fit into the structure of our Tanakh or not. Yes, Steve?
I don't like Rashi's translation of Shir HaShirim. Forget about it. What about Maccabees? Is that?
That's clearly not. That's clear. The Sefer HaMaccabim, which tells us that's clearly not canonized. Okay. So let us go. We have both in Hebrew and in English, right? So choose the side of the page that works best for you. Okay, starting, those who are looking in the Hebrew, by the top arrow, the number 1. Sholchu lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent the following message to the chacham, to the sages. Katvuni lidorot. Katvuni means write me down for all generations. Let this not just be an amazing event that the story will be told, but Katvuni lidorot, let this be written down for generations, that this should be canonized. Shalchula, they sent back to her, Halo katafti lecha shalishim. The pasuk in Mishlei says, behold, I've written it for you thrice, 3 times. And from there we understand that there are 3 places where we mention the war against Amalek. Okay, Rashi explains, the first one is in Shemos, the next one is in Devarim, and the third one is in Shmuel. That was when Shaul HaMelech went up against Amalek and did not complete the job. Right? And here's where we say something that was thrice should not be, how do you say, fouriced? I don't know. Something that was done 3 times, right? We have a license for 3 renditions of the war against Amalek, and everything else that happens afterwards will fit into those three categories, but there is not meant to be a fourth mention in Tanakh, in Scripture, about this war against Amalek. And therefore, Esther, you're too late. Right? You would be the fourth rendition, and that we are not sanctioned to write. So the issue over here at this point is not so much that Ruach HaKodesh, not Ruach HaKodesh. The issue over here is simply that we don't have a license to include this in our Tanakh, in our Scripture. Shalishim, v'lo reve'im, 3 times and not 4. Ad shematzu lo mikra katuv b'Torah. Until they found a pasuk in the Torah. Now it's not they now they found it, right? But they're going to interpret it in a manner that the pasuk, which would override Mishlei, does give sanction. Katuv b'Torah. It says in the Torah about Amalek. Kitov zot zikaron b'Sefer. Kitov, write, inscribe, zot, this, as a zikaron, as a remembrance, b'Sefer, in the book. Okay? So we're discussing the book of Esther being considered part of Scripture. Esther was another saga in the continuing saga of us against Amalek. Okay? And the pasuk in Mishlei, in Proverbs, seem to indicate that we're supposed to have 3 mentions of it, not 4. And we already have 2 in the Torah and 1 in the prophet Samuel. Therefore, we don't have an allowance for this 4th one. But they found a pasuk in the Torah which says, Kitov, write, Zot, this, Zikaron, as a remembrance, B'Sefer, in a Sefer, in a book. So they understood, Kitov, Zot, write this. What does that refer to? Mashikotav Khan, Uba Mishnah Torah. Zot, when it's written in the Torah, what does this mean? So according to this first opinion, this includes both mentions of the Torah. Both in Shemot in Exodus and in Devarim and in Deuteronomy. Therefore, write Zot, this, that refers to those 2. The pasuk says Zikaron, as a remembrance. That's referring to Mashikatuv b'Neviim. That it says in the prophets. That's the rendition. That's the story of Shmuel and Shaul, King Saul, going against Amalek. B'Sefer. So it says Ketov Zot, write this. That's 2 of the Torah. Zikaron. That's the Navi. B'Sefer. In the Sefer. What's that referring to? That has not yet been utilized. What is that? B'Sefer. Mashikatuv b'Megillah. When the Torah says write this to Torah, Zikaron, remembrance, Navi, B'Sefer means Ktuvim, Scripture, right? Megillah. So that is the license that this should be written down. The Gemara says, in fact, Kitanoi. It is a machloket Tanoim. If there are 2 sages from the period of the Tanoim, the period of the Mishnah, approximately the year 0 or slightly before 0 to about 200. Ketov, one of the things says, Ketov Zot, write this. Mashakatuv Khan. That's a reference to Shemot, Exodus. Zikaron, as a remembrance, Mashakatuv Mishnah Torah. That's Deuteronomy, that's Mishnah Torah. So each of those are split up. Zot is Shemot. Zikaron is Deuteronomy. B'Sefer, in the Sefer, in Mashakatuv b'Neviim, that which is written in the prophets, Divrei Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. So according to him, the 3 licenses have been used up for Shemot, Devarim, and Navi. Rabbi Elazar Modoi Omer, no. He says when it says Zot, that includes both Exodus, Shemot, and Devarim, Deuteronomy. He says Ketov Zot, Mashakasuv Khan, Uba Mishnah Torah. Zikaron, the remembrance then, is the reference to the Navi, Shmuel Mashkos B'Neviim, B'Sefer, that is Ketuvim, Mashikasuv B'Megillah. Okay, so this is the first of the two components. The first component is, being that this is a continuation of the battle against Amalek, so we need to mention, we need a license in Tanakh to say that yes, this should be an additional Sefer, an additional writing of the battle. And is it or is it not? That is a machloket Tanaim. Once that bar has been passed, we'd like to see some indication in the Navi, in the Megillah, in the Ketuvim, in the Megillah itself, that this was not simply Mordechai writing this story. There was divine intuition, there was divine knowledge. When he wrote this Megillah, he could only have written this Megillah if he was privy to some information that it's impossible for him to have been privy to that information were it not through a certain degree of divine knowledge that was made available to him. Yes, Steve?
Mordechai was part of the Sanhedrin?
Yes.
Now, how did that work with him being over there and the Sanhedrin being in Yerushalayim?
He was part of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Right? The Sanhedrin had already been disbanded.
Okay.
He was part of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah.
And they didn't have to be together?
They were, I believe, I'm not sure, I believe they were mostly in Bavel. Right? Now, Mordechai actually, Ratsui L'Rov Echav, one of the last pasuk that we say there, that he was willingly accepted to most of his brethren. Mordechai actually, even though he was involved in saving Klal Yisroel, right, but he was less involved in his Torah studies, so he actually became a bit demoted, right, when we list his names. It was Ratsui L'Rov Echav. Okay, but Mordechai was of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah.
So there was no conflict of interest between him being an active player in the whole thing and his recommending or...
And his writing it?
Yeah.
No. Shmuel wrote Shmuel. Right? Yehoshua, right?
Yeah.
Yirmiyahu wrote Yirmiyahu. Right? We don't view that as a conflict in interest. Okay. If you go down to, on the English, where it says number 2, right, and in the Gemara, by the second hour of the number 2, Tanya, we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Esther Beruach HaKodesh Nemra. Rabbi Eliezer says, I can prove to you, I will demonstrate to you, that Esther was said with Ruach HaKodesh, Shenemra, as the pasuk says, Vayomer Haman Bilibo. Haman said in his heart. Okay? Now, of course, this was when Haman had come early in the morning in order to tell Achashverosh that he should hang Mordechai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Him is purposely ambiguous in the Megillah. He prepared it for him. He just didn't realize who the him was. Right. The him was none other than he himself. Yes, but that was besides the point.
No conflict of interest.
Right. So, and then of course that was the night. Right. That was the night when Achashverosh was unable to sleep, and therefore he had the Sefer Zichronot, the Book of Chronicles, brought and read before him. And therein he heard about Mordechai had saved his life, and nothing was done in order to compensate him. Therefore, he wanted to give honor to Mordechai. So Haman walks in. He says, "Who's in the courtyard?" He's told Haman's in the courtyard. He said, "Well, have Haman enter." Haman enters, and the king says, "What should be done for a person Jamelech Chafetz Bikaro, that the king wants to give him honor. Haman said in his heart, who might the king want to honor more than me? And therefore he basically, as we mentioned before, he basically tells Achashverosh to recreate the whole coronation experience of when Achashverosh became king, with one difference. It should be Haman there instead of, it should be himself there instead of Achashverosh. But Haman said in his heart. Now, how can anyone truly know what is in someone else's heart? We often think we do, and we often get ourselves in trouble when we do. So how could Mordechai have written definitively, Haman said in his heart? It must be that there was Ruach HaKodesh, that there was this otherworldly information that was made available to Mordechai.
Unless he had a very loud heart.
That's Rabbi Eliezer's approach. Rabbi Akiva says, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra, he has a different way of demonstrating that Esther was said with Ruach HaKodesh. Shenemar, as the Pasuk says, Vatihi Esther nosa'at chen be'enei kol ro'eha. This is when Esther was brought before Achashverosh, right? And although the girls wanted to make themselves so beautiful for Achashverosh in order that they would be chosen, Esther was not all that interested in being chosen, right? And therefore she just followed whatever directions that were given to her by the beauty specialist there. Nevertheless, the Pasuk says, Mordechai wrote in the Megillah, Esther found favor in the eyes of all those who saw her. How do you know? Maybe it was 99 out of 100. Maybe it was 999 out of 1,000. Right? Who knows? How can you possibly know how the people who saw Esther, how every single one of them felt about her? Only if you are privy to some divine knowledge. That's Rabbi Akiva's proof that Esther was written with Ruach HaKodesh. Yes?
Or he interviewed all those courtiers afterwards.
Who's all the courtiers? This is all Kol Ro'eha. Right? Right? How does he know? Right? If it was a closed audience, and there were 6 people who saw her, so granted, he could interview those 6. Right? But beyond that, and even so, how do you really know if what they're telling you is accurate? Right? Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir has a different proof from the Megillah. Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra Shenemar. We know that Esther was said with this divine knowledge. Shenemar, as it says, Vayivada Hadavar LeMordechai. This is a different type of indication. Here it's not that the writer wrote something that how could he have known that to be the case were it not for Ruach HaKodesh, but this is talking about the plot to assassinate Achashverosh. Bigtan and Seresh had the plan to kill Achashverosh. Vayivada hadavar leMordechai. The matter became known to Mordechai. So here it's not necessarily in the writing of the Megillah, but how did Mordechai know about it? It must be that he was in a state of Ruach HaKodesh, and that is when that information was availed to him that Bigsan and Teresh are trying to kill Achashverosh. Tell Esther to tell Achashverosh. Yes, Dov. You saying Dov is first? Yes, Dov?
Okay, there's 2 things here that became known to Mordechai. One is the one that you said. The other one, he knew about the secret sale of the silver with the king and Haman. The other one,
where do we see that we know that he knew about that?
Because here he overhears, he knew the language of all those guys talking.
We'll come to that soon.
Okay.
Janet?
I was going to ask that. Didn't Mordechai overhear the plot at the gate?
Oh, we'll come to that soon. Good.
So how did he have to have anything divinely inspired if he actually...
That's going to be a challenge. The Gemara is going to bring challenges to most of these proofs. We'll be left with a few that are still standing. Rabbi Yossi ben Durmaskit, Omer, Rabbi Yossi the son of Durmaskit, he said, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra. I've got a different indication, a different source for Esther being said Baruch HaKodesh Nemar. Uva biza lo shalchu et yadam. This is at the end of the Megillah when the Jews had V'nahapachu, the 13th day of Adar, the day that had been designated for our destruction. V'nahapachu, right, got turned around. Instead, we took revenge. We went to battle and avenged against our enemies. And the pasuk says, "Uva biza lo shalchu et yadam." But to the spoils, no one had sent forth their hands. No spoils were taken. Now, how could you possibly know that? Right? You have people all out, all over the place, far, far away. Right? How can you possibly monitor that? In our day and age, we can't even monitor a Boeing 747. 777, excuse me, that disappeared. Right? There was no way for them to monitor that no one took any of the spoils. How could Mordechai have written that unless he knew that to be a fact? How do you know that to be a fact? That is through Ruach HaKodesh. It's interesting. There are always two ways that someone can know something. The classic example I always like to give is the duration of the lunar month. 29.5876, whatever it is. Right? Down to less than a second, or a few seconds, down to within a few seconds. And NASA in the 1970s established this telescope. They were able to measure it. Once they announced their numbers, someone said to the scientists, by the way, the Jews have had that since the time of the Talmud. Right? They've had that for about 2,000 years. Right? So his response was, lucky guess. Right? Lucky guess. Now, if he had another lucky guess, he'd probably be a millionaire from the stock market. But it wasn't another lucky guess. Right? And so there are two ways. Either we can observe something and understand it, or we can be privy. We can have the building plans. We can be privy to information that is given to us by someone who is in the know. And that is why ultimately science and Torah will all perfectly merge. Because one is looking at the evidence and understanding what took place. The other one is being told what actually took place. And as in the case of the length, the duration of the lunar month, they came together. Ultimately, it will all come together once we fully understand our science and fully understand our Torah. At that point, there will be absolute convergence. But over here, there's no way that Mordechai could have observed that no one took any of the spoils, and therefore the only way that he could have stated that is if he knew that. How could he possibly know such a thing? Ruach HaKodesh. So these are, Rabbi Eliezer is a Tana, Rabbi Akiva is a Tana, Rabbi Meir is a Tana, Rabbi Yosef ben Dormiski is a Tana. Along comes an Amora, and Amora is about the years 200 to 500. Amar Shmuel says, I havai hatam, if I were there, hava amina milta da'adifa mikulhu, I would have said something that was better, stronger than all of them. Shneamar, what is Shmuel's proof? Kiyamu v'kiblu. Kiyamu v'kiblu means it was Kiyamu, it was established, v'kiblu, and they accepted it. Kiyamu v'kiblu Yehudim, the Jews, it was established and it was accepted. He understands it to mean as follows: Kiyamu lamala, mashikiblu lamata. It was established up above in the heavens that which the Jews had accepted down below over here, meaning as follows. We had accepted that every year we would make Purim. We would celebrate. Every year. B'kol shana v'shana. Each and every year we would celebrate Purim. Meaning, we are not viewing this as, and with all the Jewish holidays, It's not a singular event that took place. Rather, this has carved its niche into our yearly cycle. And whatever was available in this spiritual, ruchani sense that was maximized Purim, every year we come back to that same port, that same availability when we return to that date. So we travel through time, docking at these different ports, at redemption, Pesach, Matan Torah, Shavuos, Judgment, Rosh Hashanah, forgiveness, Yom Kippur, closeness, Sukkot, and they established in the heavens that which we had accepted down below. This would be annual. They created that port, Purim, accepting Torah, Me'ava, out of love, Achdut, brotherhood, closeness with one another. All of that came together. So he says, now, Kimu Lamala, how could you possibly know what was established in the heavens without Ruach HaKodesh? Amar Rava. So Shmuel's is a very different type of indication. Because first of all, it's telling us what happened in the Shamayim, in the heavens. But it's not explicit, so it has that advantage. How can you possibly know what happened in the heavens without Ruach HaKodesh? However, it's not explicit in the Pasuk. It doesn't say in the Pasuk, and in the heavens they accepted. It says they accepted, they established, and he says it means, oh, in the heavens they established that which we accepted down here. So in terms of it being explicit in the Pasuk, it's not explicit in the Pasuk, as the other indications were. But in terms of it being indisputable, once we accept that that's what the Pasuk means, then there's no way to explain away how he knew what was happening in heavens without there being some sort of knowledge sharing from the divine down to us. And that's why when Ciner second, then Amar Rava said, "Lekulu itlu pircha levar midu Shmuel." To all of the others, there is a challenge. We can slug it up. We can disprove it, except for midu Shmuel, except for Shmuel's. Yes, Steve. The Leslie pircha, there is no disproof.
It's my mind going off
In Ruach HaKodesh
exactly,
avenues, yes.
Exactly. No, you know, the walls of the base measure should lean in, and below Bashamayim and it's given to us to establish.
Wait, that's in terms of halacha. Halacha, we need to use our understanding of Torah to arrive at our conclusion for halacha. We're not going to take a psak min hashamayim, a baskol, right? But our Sifrei Tanakh are certainly divinely inspired. That's what we're talking about over here, right? Was this Mordechai's, bestseller, or was this Tanakh? Right? So therefore, all Tanakh is certainly divinely inspired. So the Gemara now works through, and some of you brought up some of these points before, how each of the first proofs that the Tanaim brought were not necessarily proofs. The Rabbi Eliezer, the first one of Eliezer was that Haman said in his heart, who does the king want to honor more than me? So the proof of Ruach HaKodesh was, how could Mordechai, or the writer of the Megillah, know what was happening in Haman's heart? The Gemara says, no. Svarahu. That could be a pretty logical, simple deduction.
Right.
To lo avi inish dechashiv lamalka kavaseh. Clearly, Haman knew accurately that there was no one more important in the kingdom besides Achashverosh than he. Clearly, he was the number 2 man in this kingdom. The high kimapish tuva, and when he kept going on and on and on about all the honor that should be given to the one that the king wants to honor, the Amar, he kept saying more and more, it's clear, Adaite denafshe ka'amar. So even without Ruach HaKodesh, Mordechai could have confidently written,
right.
And Haman said in his heart, who does the king want to honor more than me? right? Because from the whole context, it's very clear that Haman is not heaping all of this honor onto anyone else besides himself. The Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was that we said that Esther found favor in the eyes of all those who saw her. Dilma, perhaps, Karabi Elazar. So we asked, how could he possibly know what's in the hearts of all those who saw? Only through Ruach HaKodesh. Gemara says, not necessarily. Rabbi Elazar has a teaching over here, Da'amar, who says, Malamed, we learn, Shekol Echad Ve'echad Nidmata Lo Ke'umato. Esther would not tell her nationality. Okay? Now, once she appeared, Rabbi Elazar says there was this tremendous buzz in the crowd. Right? Everyone from Brooklyn was saying, oh, that's a Brooklyn girl, if I ever saw one. Right? Others were saying, I wish they all could be California. No, that's a California girl. No, that's a Madai girl. No, that's a Paras girl. No, she's a this. Everyone was claiming her for themselves. Kol echad ve'echad, to each and every person, nidmata, she appeared lo to him, ke'umato, that she was from his nation. So if that's the buzz, if everyone is engaged in this serious debate, each one claiming she's mine, she's from my country, she's from my nationality, then Mordechai can write without any divine intervention or knowledge. He could say she found favor in the eyes of all those who saw her. V'had Rabbi Meir said that the matter became known to Mordechai. The matter referring to the plot, the assassination plot of Bigdan and Teresh, that became known to Mordechai. How did he know about this plot? Only through Ruach HaKodesh. Gemara says no. There's another way of explaining that. Dilma, perhaps, K'Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Perhaps it's like Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, said to Amar, who said, Bigtan v'Teresh shnei tarshiyin hayu. Bigtan and Teresh, these two guards, they were these two people from Terja, Tarshi, whatever that is. Tarshiyim. Right? And they spoke this dialect that very few people spoke. Therefore, they were comfortable conversing about their plans with an earshot of others, because who's going to understand it? Mordecai. What they didn't realize was that Mordechai, who was from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, that Mordechai was a person who spoke 70 languages, and he did understand that language. And he heard their plot, and he heard them arranging that it's right, we don't have the same shift, I'll cover your shift, and that way you'll be able to have time to go there and do it. So therefore, the matter became known to Mordechai. How did the matter become known? Loose lips sinks ships. Right? They felt confident speaking in this very, very unusual dialect, not knowing that Mordechai in fact understood it. Therefore, there was according to that, there was no Ruach HaKodesh involved whatsoever. There was certainly what we call Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, which positioned Mordechai right there when they were speaking that language and speaking that language of their plans. There was certainly a lot of divine providence, but there's always divine providence. Here we're talking about almost something quasi-nevuah, quasi-prophecy, right? Information being imparted to me, that's already a whole new level.
Well, it's like the brothers before Yosef. They were speaking, thinking that he couldn't understand them. Correct.
I'm sorry,
Right? Right. Steve mentioned that when the brothers were speaking in front of Yosef, there was a meturgaman, there was a translator there, thinking that Yosef did not understand their language, and that's a very enviable position to be in. When people think that you have no clue, especially in the Yosef situation, you have no clue what they're talking about, you might be hearing exactly what they're saying. And then it gets translated, and then you hear the differences in the translation. I was once at a Sheva Brachas, and the girl was from a very, very somewhat sheltered family, right? It was Torah. There was no sports, just all of that just was not right. And the young man that who was marrying her was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, but he also knew about all the sports and all of these things. So, and the bride didn't speak English. Okay, so it was all being translated for her. So it's very funny because they say, and so and the Chatan, the groom, right? He is, right? He knows all, he's gone through the entire Gemara and he knows it so well. That was translated, right? And he goes, at the same time, he knows every single sports score of every single team. And in Hebrew, they say, what? It's hard to find any knowledge that he doesn't know. but when there's the translation, it fits the crowd. Right. So over here, right, as in the case, Steve, as you said, with Yosef and the brothers, right, there was a translator, all right, by Yosef. Over here, they thought no one would know what's being said, but he knew exactly what was being said. So there was in that case, there was no Ruach HaKodesh involved. There was, as I said, Hashgacha Pratis, divine orchestration, that Mordechai happened to be within earshot when they were talking about this plan, but that is always the case. Lastly, Vahadar Yossi ben Durmaskit, he said that the Pasuk said that no one partook of any of the spoils. How could Mordechai possibly know that no one partook of the spoils? That too, Dilma, perhaps, Pristiki Shadur, perhaps there were officers that were sent around. Achashverosh wanted to ascertain, right, what is going on. And officers were sent around, and they came back and they reported no spoils were taken. Right? And therefore, we could write in the Megillah, no spoils were taken. That was what was investigated. That was the conclusion of the investigation. Maybe one person might, right? You can still write. It was investigated. The report came back, and Mordechai wrote that no spoils were taken. So those first opinions could be challenged. However, the Shmuel, but the last one, that was Shmuel who said, Kimu v'kiblu was established in the heavens, that which was accepted down here, that Vadai certainly late lay pircha. That certainly, there is no challenge to that, there is no way to negate that proof. Amar Ravina says, Hayinu da Amri Inchi, there's an expression people say, Tava chade pilpalta charifta meimalitzani kari. It's better to have one hot pepper than a whole barrel full of curry of melons. Right? You want one good hot pepper instead of a whole basket full of melons. Right? So we had all of these explanations, but Shmuel's explanation was that one hot pepper, right, that lasted. The Gemara concludes now with two other explanations. Rav Yosef Amar Mehacha. Rav Yosef says from here, V'yimei HaPurim. Just 1 second. Rav Yosef says, the Pasuk says, V'yimei HaPurim ha'eleh lo yavru mitoch ha-Yehudim. He says these days of Purim will not pass from amongst the Jews. Now, how can I possibly write what will be generations going forward? These days of Purim will not pass from amongst the Jews. Now, we know that's true. Here we are, 2014, celebrating Purim, having just celebrated Purim. So we see that it's true, but how do you write it then? How do you write it then? Rav Nachman Yitzchak says, Mehacha. from that very same pasuk, from the end of the pasuk. V'zichram, and its remembrance, lo yasuf, will never end, mi zaram, from their descendants. So why didn't Rav Nachman like the first half of the pasuk that Rav Yosef brought? Rav Yosef said, the pasuk reads, in these days of Purim will never pass from amongst the Jews, and their memory will not end from their descendants. Rav Yosef brought from the first half of the pasuk, these days of Purim will never pass from amongst the Jews. Rav Nachman, Rav Yitzchak brought from the latter half of the pasuk, and the memory will never stop from their descendants. So take a look at the very bottom Tosfot. Those who are with me in Hebrew, outside column, last couple of words. Rav Nachman, Amar Mehacha v'zichram lo yasuk mizaram, the Bereisha Dikra, because from the first half of the pasuk that Rav Yosef brought, that it said these days of Purim will never pass from amongst the Jews, lo chazin, we only see Ella ha-Yehudim sheba'oto hador. The pasuk only said these days of Purim will never pass from amongst the Jews, right? What might it be saying? All those Jews who lived it, right, who experienced it, right, the days of Purim will never pass. You can be rest assured, right, every year of their life comes this date, they're going to raise their cups and they're going to celebrate. Right? So that's something that Mordechai can say. Right? I can say, right, anyone who experienced that crazy deliverance that we went through will never forget it. Mm-hmm. They'll never forget it. Mm-hmm. Right? That will never, these days of Purim will never pass from amongst those people. Right? Until the day of their death. They will remember this, they will celebrate it. That's not Ruach HaKodesh necessarily. But go further and say, and its memory will never stop from their descendants?
Because
who knows?
We're commanded to remember Amalek, though. So
remember Amalek. What does that have to do with Purim?
Because we remember.
You might.
By knowing that.
You might, but there's no. It's not, the commandment to remember Amalek is not to remember Purim. So you might use Purim as a vehicle, but it's not clearly not part and parcel of that.
So we discussed how important a holiday Purim is. Was it established then that it was one of maybe the most important holiday?
Well,
and therefore, if you're a Jew, you will remember that holiday because it's all important. And only if all the Jews are gone would future generations not be able to celebrate.
So are you
Purim.
challenging Stu and saying that maybe it's not?
Yeah.
Right? At that point, you couldn't know what place in history this would be. Okay. There have been, right, there's a whole Megillah. There have been many other times of us being in danger and being saved. So right there, looking back, we say, oh, of course. Right? But real time, one doesn't know how it's going to play forward. So once, Rav Nachman says, once the pasuk said it will never cease from their seed, that is clear. The only way that Mordechai could have known that is Ruach HaKodesh. And for me, what's so beautiful about this Gemara is we are the living representatives, the living proof of this Ruach HaKodesh as we every year celebrate Purim and Zichram lo Yasuf. We can see and show it has not stopped. It has not stopped Mezaram. Yes, Jen.
One thing, though, the argument that it was accepted in Shemayim, and we knew that, so we observe here, that could be a tautology. We are maybe making that assumption because we do observe that it was it could be circular logic.
Well, Shmuel's statement was the Megillah is telling us that it was accepted in Shemayim.
Where does it? See, I don't get that.
That's what I said before. It's not explicit in the pasuk. Right? Tosfos actually asks that. There are other ways of reading that pasuk also. So what Tosfos says, but the other one, right? Lo dami hai pircha lishar pircha is the inach tasatis v'atam legamrei. Right? The other ones, right? Your whole proof is not a proof. Right? It became known to Mordechai. He overheard it. Right? The spoils. They sent messengers. Right? Right? Everyone was claiming that she was from them. Right? Who else could, right? All that just gets to the core of it. Here we could say, well, maybe it doesn't mean that. Fair enough. Shmuel had the tradition that that's exactly what it means. Right? So based on that tradition, that's what it means. You can only know that through Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, my friends, we will call it over here. And I thank you all for adjusting your schedules to our Wednesday this week.
Can you look at Esther?